Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center and to this book talk. I am delighted to have with us today our Wilson Center Fellow, Stephen Kramer. Stephen is a historian of contemporary Europe with special expertise on France. He brings both policy and professorial experience to Wilson, having been both a professor at National Defense University as well as an advisor to the State Department, and we love that combination here at Wilson. Stephen's research has looked at a range of subjects: how post-war France was shaped by the experience of the resistance and liberation, a look at European socialism as well as European security and defense. Stephen's last book, titled The Other Population Crisis, examined how developed nations have historically attempted to deal with low and declining birth rates. Today we're here to discuss Stephen's most recent book, Jews, Muslims, and the French Republic. It examines the situation of Muslims in France today by comparing it with the development of the French Jewish community, delving into the historical experiences of both. Combining his two specialties, Stephen ends the book with some policy recommendations, which I know readers will want to look at closely. So here's how this is going to go. I'm going to ask Stephen a few questions, and we'll have a little discussion here. I will then look to you all for some questions for what I hope will be a vibrant discussion here, and not only here in the room at Wilson, but also online. So two how-tos for this discussion to make it even better. If you're asking a question from the room and from the floor, please hit the button on your mic. It'll turn green at the bottom, but also then remember to turn it off. Otherwise, we'll get some static on the internet discussion. If you are watching this online, then please send us your questions to GEP for Global Europe Program, GEP@wilsoncenter.org, and I'll see those questions and I'll be able to ask them from here, okay? And with that, we'll get started. So, Stephen, I want to start by asking you, what prompted you to write this book? I know you were a public policy fellow here at the Wilson Center in 2017. I was also on a gap year here at the Wilson Center from the State Department at that time. So walk us through the events that led you to focus on this theme.
Well, the events that really shocked me were the two events of January 2015, the massacre of the 12 members of the editorial board of, satirical, often crude magazine, Charlie Hebdo, which had a caricature of Muhammad. And this led to a group of jihadis coming to their office and killing everybody. And around the same time, in a different part of Paris, some other extremists attacked a store called Hyper Cacher, which is basically like a convenience store, like a 7-Eleven with kosher products. And they took people captive and then killed 4 of them. The first event, you could say, had some political dimension. The fourth one was just a pure and simple murder of Jews for its own sake. And this was in a context of all kinds of problems in France between the state and the Muslim population. And so I was thinking, well, maybe I need to look into the impact of all this on the Jewish community. And then I realized that, there's a lot written on the Jewish community. That's not the real question. The question is to look at the triangular relationship of France, Jews, and Muslims. There's a lot in common in the way France dealt with Jews and then later on dealt with Muslims. And then, being a historian, I said that the idea is to look at a current policy issue, but put it into a historical context. That context, unfortunately, meant going back to 1789, because it's around during the revolution that the issue of how Jews fit into society and whether they should be citizens was first raised. And then to look widely into the colonial world because, France didn't have Muslims in France proper, but the real contact with them, the biggest one was the conquest of Algeria in 1830. And so you have to look long back, and you have to look in the colonial world as well as metropolitan France. And that meant this was going to be a long project. The Wilson Center had given me that fellowship as a result of this in 2017, for which I'm really grateful because I don't see how I could possibly have begun this project without the Wilson Center's help.
Well, we appreciate it when we see a project come to fruition as well, so that is all to the good. Maybe you could give us a little bit, noting that you had to go back and do some of the historical examination, a look at some of the historic factors that you thought were most definitive in shaping both the Jewish and Muslim communities in France today.
Well, I think that you can look upon this story as a play in 3 acts and 2 stages. So, to put it metaphorically, the first place is France. It begins in 1789 and around that time, which is how France dealt with Jews in French territory, in the French nation. That begins with citizenship being given to Jews in 1791, 1792. It's about the special relationship that French Jews felt towards France. Because there's what I call the French paradox, and that is in no country in Europe did Jews get full rights, citizenship, political rights, entry into all the professions before, other than France. It took a long, long time before, that's Britain, for example, Germany, gave Jews those kinds of rights. So it's an extraordinary thing, and Jews were profoundly grateful for that. You can all talk about a Jewish love affair with France. You can talk about significant writers saying that the revolution was like the coming of the Messiah. And so it's a real deep feeling towards France. You have Jews in it's a tiny community, like 40,000. This is very small. And no one at the time of the revolution was very notable. It was no one famous. But as time went on, Jews became very successful in journalism. By the Third Republic in 1875 on, very prominent in education, in law, and so on, and in business, even in the army. So let me point out that a certain Captain Dreyfus in the intelligence bureau of the French army, no other country in Europe would a Jew be in a position that there were Jewish generals. So you have that, something very, very significant. On the other hand, the other side of this paradox is that there was a rise of anti-Semitism. The more successful the Jews were, the more this anti-Semitism rose. And so that's why I talk about a French paradox. And the high point of that anti-Semitism was during the Dreyfus Affair, which most of you know about. A Jewish officer accused of espionage for the Germans, evidence trumped up by various people in the army. It becomes a great affair. It lasts for years with a lot of anti-Semitism as a result. And then, the other time when you have a rise of anti-Semitism is in the 1930s. Well, if you have fascism in Italy and Germany, by God, you're going to have the same kind of thing in France. A far right, and the essence of being on the far right in France in those days was being anti-Semitic. It was all to be on the right, you had to be an anti-Semite. And so you have a big wave of that. But the main thing is that the Republic protects Jews, despite everything. And eventually those waves subside. The problem arises when the Republic itself is overthrown. And that's when France is defeated in the Battle of May-June 1940 by Germany, and the Republic collapses, and you have the so-called Vichy regime. And the Vichy regime is not only a regime which supports anti-Semites, but many of the major ones were in the government. And so without any pressure from the Germans, you have the Statute of the Jews of October 40, which takes away their citizenship. It simply abrogates citizenship, kicks them out of the professions, out of education, and eventually 2 years later, the Vichy government actively helps find Jews and deliver them to the Germans to be sent to death camps. So much for the love, that Jews for France. It's shocking. If you ever see the French Village, that TV series, it's, doesn't matter if it's completely historical. It's large enoughly historical. It gives you a sense of what that was like. So that's the first stage, and you can say that the first act ends with Vichy. And then there's the second part of it, which is a different stage. It's the stage of North Africa. When France seizes Algeria, conquers Algeria in 1830, it has two populations to deal with, this huge Muslim population and a significant but small Jewish population. There is no French paradox for Muslims, like pure oppression. I mean, it's really pretty horrible. You have the overthrow, all the property, the major property of many Muslims is seized. There are no political rights, there are no civic rights for Muslims. They become, ironically, aliens in their own country. The official country is French. The settlers are citizens. The Muslims are not. Eventually, they become defined as Muslim as their official definition. So their religious affiliation becomes how they're identified. And so, you have an incredibly oppressive and violent thing. More so because there are big revolts by people like Abdel Kader. The French put them down. So, the long and short is that you have a long history of Algeria. In the 20th century, some attempts to give some kinds of benefits to Muslims, to a small minority. Some get education, but by the time of the revolution takes place, the population is like 8% male literate, and women nowhere near that. So I said, so much for the civilizing mission that the French talk about. Civilizing mission is a great thing to tell people in Paris when you have a colonial exposition. The wonderful things that it's not true. There's nothing like that is happening. It's truly hypocritical. And that, of course, leads to, eventually, to the revolution of 1954. And the war that goes on for 8 years, which is a truly terrible war. If you've seen the Battle of Algiers, it gives you some picture. It's a really brutal war. And in the end, the level of brutality is so great that there's no place for anybody who's not Algerian Muslim. So all the white settlers, the French settlers, have to flee to France. The Jewish population has to leave. The soldiers who had fought on the French side, the Harkies, they have to get out if they can. And by the way, de Gaulle makes no effort to help them leave. In fact, doesn't want them to leave. It's an appalling part of de Gaulle's life. His famous statement that if all these Muslims came, his town would no longer be Colombe les deux églises, the two churches, it would be Colombe les deux mosquées, the two mosques. Fortunately, a lot of them do get out. And then later on, a lot of Algerians come to France simply for employment. So the province of the southern rim of the Mediterranean end up moving to the northern rim. And what you have today, the third act, is more or less a continuation of a lot of the tensions that existed during the Algerian War. It's amazing how much that remains sort of fact of life.
Yeah. France's approach to colonial rule in Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, really, in your book, you show the continuing impact. I want to read a little quote from your book, and that is, The fact that France dealt with Jews and Muslims differently would eventually result in the collision course between the two groups that still exists today and is the root of the charge that France practices a double standard. Can you tell us more about how this legacy actually plays out in French society today?
Well, I didn't tell you anything about what happened to Jews in Algeria, and I think I need to say that because that's the beginning of the story. So there were about 100,000 Jews in Algeria. I mean, they were Algerian. They were part of, what you could call the Islamicate. I mean, Jewish in religion, but, they fit into that society. It hadn't been necessarily wonderful because Jews were supposed to have some protection from the Pact of Omar. They were supposed to, be let to live. They were better off than in Europe during the Middle Ages, that's for sure. But it wasn't always great. When, it's the kind of thing where you have to walk in the gutter, and in Tunisia, if there was a Muslim there, he could smack you in the head. It's just because he could. So it wasn't a great life. When the French come, the question is, what do you do? Well, with the Muslims, it's obvious, but they put them down. What about the Jews? So, there wasn't agreement on that. But the significant factor in what happens to them is the French Jewish community. Because, as I told you, there's a lot of success on the part of Jews. From a very insignificant, small group of people, they never become a huge group of people, but they have a lot of people who become very prominent in the professions and in politics. So what happens is that some of the French Jewish community, they're concerned about the Algerian Jews. They're concerned about two things. One was they wanted them to get citizenship like they had. But then, there was a mission in 1840. These Jews look like Arabs. They don't look like Europeans. You have to make them into Europeans. And they have to make them into the kind of Jews that you had in France, not the kind of Jews you had in North Africa. Not that they all wanted to be like that. And so there's a kind of missionary work of forcing Jews to be European-like Jews. And at the same time, the French Jewish community was aiming to give them citizenship. So the opportunity arises in a sort of unfortunate way in 1870. The French had were losing in the Franco-Prussian War. Napoleon III was out. There was a kind of government of public safety. The foreign minister was Kramer. And Kramer was probably the most prominent Jew in France. He was a great lawyer. He was old. He had done lots of things, participated in many missions to help Jews who were being in trouble in other parts of the world, like the Damascus affair, the Mortara affair. But there he was, as interior minister. Interior minister is a powerful position in France. And so he simply issued a decree, the eponymous decree, the Kramer decree, which said Algerian Jews are now French citizens. And he didn't do that, I don't think, he did it for any kind of political reason to divide up one community. He was just someone who wanted to do something for the French Jewish community, as he'd wanted to do for the Algerian Jewish community, like he'd done for the French. And so suddenly now Jews have citizenship. Some minor inconveniences, like they can't get divorced now. They can't practice polygamy, which a few actually did. But it's a huge breakthrough. And unfortunately, you have the same kind of problem in Algeria as you had in France, except that it's much worse. Namely, the settlers hate the Jews. It's vehement anti-Semitism. And so they never really accept the Jews as being equal citizens, and they deeply resent it. And the Muslim population isn't very happy either, because suddenly these people who are below them now are above them. And so some of that issue of Jews are being treated differently, being treated differently by the French, becomes a factor. By the way, in Tunisia and Morocco, it doesn't happen because the governors general will be damned if they can let Jews become citizens. So they don't become citizens there. But in Algeria, despite efforts to roll it back, no, it sticks. So I think part of the problem between Jews and Muslims is the idea that Jews are treated better. And then I think that continues when, after so many people forced out of Algeria and go to France. Jews almost all go to France. Hawkeys go to France. Settlers go to France. By the way, the settlers later on have their revenge. They become the electoral base of the National Front when it's founded in the 1970s. And if you look at the National Front today, the second party in France, it comes in large part from those settlers who were angry at being dispossessed. So that's interesting. Anyway, when the Jews come to France, they're treated better than Muslims because there are Jews who help them out. There's Jewish organizations that sort of try to take care of them. They're citizens. They have all kinds of rights as citizens. They all speak French because they've gone to French schools. They're well educated. They manage more or less to become a success in French society. The Muslims who come to France, first of all, Muslims don't basically come to France because they want to be in France. They come to France because there's a lot of unemployment after independence, and so they come there for jobs. They don't take on, they could have gotten French citizenship, but they don't want it because it seems somehow after a war like they had to become French is sort of becoming part of the enemy. So they don't become citizens. So they don't have any legs up. And then Jews had been mostly in commerce and trade and business, state service. The Muslims, were kept illiterate, so they ended up being just laborers. So already you have a big difference between, the social advancement. When the Muslims finally decide they want citizenship, but they're going to stay in France, they're way behind. And what happens is that this fact is turned into a justification for the idea that the Jews have been given special treatments, and a huge resentment there. And that, of course, it's fair to say that the element of discrimination against Muslims, which is gigantic, makes it seem worse. And so, yes, Muslims do feel that they're not being treated as well as Jews, and there's some reasons to think so. It's not that the Jews somehow or other did it on purpose, like Kramer didn't do what he did because he wanted to put the Muslims down. He did it because he was trying to help the Jewish population, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's a structural issue.
A
structural legacy of colonialism.
Yeah. And then, of course, what happens when these Muslims come to France, they come because there are a lot of jobs after World War II. There are a lot of jobs. It's rebuilding. It's a period of great French economic growth, the so-called 30 longue is 30 great years. And so there are plenty of jobs for unskilled labor. And the extent to which they were able to work in unionized jobs, being a member of the CGT, which is the Communist Union, gives you some sense of solidarity with other French people. But then these jobs fade out because France sort of deindustrializes. They finish the rebuilding. And then a lot of Muslims who had come for jobs find themselves without much. And so one of the problems you find is this unemployment problem. France has had a long history of unemployment, but it's especially strong for minorities. And then you have other kinds of discrimination, intentional or otherwise. Like, Muslims lived in kind of bidonville, like shacks when they first came. But then eventually when they bring their families, they need a place to stay. Well, French had built after the war these huge complexes known as a cité, and the French concept was we're going to make things different. People didn't have decent places to live. We're going to give them nice places to live. High towers with running water, bathrooms, what's not to like? Except, if you visit these places, they're sort of isolated. They're outside of any major urban areas. And the result is that they're like a factory for anomie, and that's a really bad problem. But then you have the fact
I'm
that
going to ask you to define anomie for our non-French speakers.
rootlessness,
Okay.
a term invented by the French sociologist Émile Durkheim. So we're in the French. Anyway, if you've seen these places, you wouldn't want to live there. they're in the middle of nowhere. You know, the thing that makes French life nice, cafes and all that kind of stuff, you don't have that. Little shops, you know, little meat stores, vegetables. I mean, if you need to go to work, good luck, because it's not near a metro or bus. It's a real, real problem. So, you know, Muslims, it's not as if these buildings were built for Muslims. They were built for ordinary French citizens, but the French citizens got out when they could. And so it becomes almost entirely minority. So that's a problem. Well, if you go to schools, the neighborhood schools were right near these projects. So they were almost all minorities. And so, you know, the idea of being integrated into French society becomes much more difficult. And then there's the fact that the police, you know, in France, you know, they do it to kind of stop and frisk very much. And anybody who sort of looks a little bit different, which means dark skin, et cetera, and if you dress differently, you know, the cops just pull you over all the time. And so you get this sense of being discriminated against. That breeds a high level of resentment, and the isolation also breeds delinquency. And so you have a problem that grows there. And there's another thing that's really bad, and that is the French claim that this is a society based on equality. And so you can't have any special legislation that, you know, like to help a particular group at the expense of another. Forgetting that for a long, long time, particular groups were discriminated against. Mm-hmm. So, you know, everyone now is equal, everyone in the name of the Republic, so we're not going to help the people who really have had decades and decades of discrimination. That's a real big problem in France. It's a problem, you know, in this country, with the same kind of feeling that we shouldn't, you know, help minority groups because everybody should be treated equally. But of course, if they haven't been treated equally for 100 years, that's, you know, that is another story.
So I'm gonna move ahead a little bit from this and say, right, at the same time as France is experiencing those years of rebuilding and economic development,
Yeah.
these are also the years in which the European Union is developing itself. And I wonder if you could give me a sense of how what impact that had on both of the communities in France.
In some ways, not a lot. Not directly. Indirectly, maybe. Because yes, there are a lot of great things about freedom of movement and so on for those people who can take advantage of it, mostly middle-class people. And, you know, the people who had come to France, the Muslims who had come to France had come from French-speaking colonies. Mm-hmm. So they tend to stay there. I think the biggest problem, in a certain sense, is that in this big Europe, various groups become fearful that the space that's only theirs is being taken away, that they're not being protected by the state, that anybody can come. So I think the far right tends to thrive in that big European universe, because what they're asking for is, give me back my state. You know, the protections of social benefits have been really identified with the state. The state was a bulwark against the rest of the world. And losing that becomes a real problem. And I think it's not coincidental that the rise of the far right, you know, the far right thrives under those conditions. The people's home, you know, the Swedes talked about the people's home, the Social Democrats, but the people, those calling for the people's home now are the far right. Restoration of those boundaries. So I think that has an impact, and it helps support the extreme right, which of course is by nature anti-immigration.
Yeah, this brings me to the question that I had as a follow-up to that. We saw the real political consequences of the influx of migrants in 2015, and that was, as you say, that also the time when you were thinking about the genesis of this book. So that also brought a conversation about burden sharing among European countries and so forth. How did that play out within France? Can you give us a sense of that?
Well, I think that the vast amount of immigration at that time had a huge consequence on the far right. The fear of being engulfed, invaded by people from outside, people of different religions and different colors. I think that was a very powerful effect. And so it really helps the far right grow. Now, in France, as I say, there's not a lot of, despite all the refugees coming, they weren't trying to go to France. They were going to Germany, jobs, maybe to Sweden. Not many to France. The immigration tends to follow, the old colonial lines in France. It's the people from French colonies. So, it really had no major effect in terms of real movement of people, but it's a level of fear. So I think you can trace the rise of a lot of parties at the far right and their growth to that period. The AfD in Germany, the neo-fascists in Italy, for sure, really thrived, and the National Front in France. And that, I think, is important to mention, because according to a recent poll, if there was a redo of the French elections, Le Pen would win over Macron. And if there's anything that Macron is worried about, it's the idea that he will be succeeded by Le Pen, that his heritage will be the election of Le Pen, and he frankly should worry about that. So the National Front in this period in France, as I say, a party that was based on this Algerian experience, above all, it's about immigration and not immigration of Norwegians, immigration of Muslims from North Africa. So it really rose. The guy who ran it, the old man Le Pen, it's true to say he's doing it for a lark, but it's not as if he expected ever to form a government. He hated a lot of people. He hated North Africa, he hated Muslims for obvious reasons. He hated the Gaullists, which had been the major party in France, because it was de Gaulle who ended the war in Algeria and gave it up. And he didn't like Jews either, because, he was a classic far-right guy. How could you not like Jews? So he made all kinds of smart-ass comments that were anti-Semitic. So, with that kind of thing, you get people who are just discontented but don't really want to come to power. So, he did well, but never had a chance of becoming president. Then his daughter came in, and she basically kicked the old man out. And the main thing she did was, this is not a party of anti-Semitism. No. If you're an anti-Semite, get out. And she kicked him out. So, and she wasn't going to be crude either. No, she didn't say she hated Muslims and Islam, but she certainly didn't want any more immigration, which is to say the same thing. And she has been a very successful politician, and she benefited from immigration in other countries, and she made her party into a real party of the right, a party that wanted to be a government party. And it's fair to say that her party is sort of now potentially on the threshold of power. And so she certainly benefited from that. And yes, the party is anti-immigration, anti-Muslim without wanting to say it. And even, and then this Minister of the Interior in France, government, had the nerve of saying the problem with Le Pen is she wasn't tough enough on Islam. Can you imagine? That was a great statement. So you see, that party with discontent is managing to thrive. That's the main result, it seems to me, of what was going on. And of course, why is Maloney prime minister in Spain? Because this propelled by the same thing. But Maloney is also very smart, like Marine Le Pen, and she got there first. She got to be prime minister. But it's the same kind of impulse.
I'm going to go to the last chapter of your book. So if you're interested in spoiler alerts, y'all, this is one, okay? Because I want to go to the last chapter of your book where you talk about some policy recommendations for the French government. So anybody who doesn't want to have some revelations, this would be the point at which you hit mute on your machine. But otherwise, I liked the fact that you wanted to say something to the French government about how to deal with these issues. And you made that a part of the final chapter of your book. Can you outline the key steps that you think that France should take in this regard?
But I'm going to lose my readership. As
See,
you
I
said, this
told
is very
spoiler alerts.
embarrassing. It is. Well, I think any of you have any interest in reading this book, don't listen to this. And if you've already read it, it's the case of a few people, then you can listen. So I also want to say that this, the idea of giving advice to the French government at this point is more or less pointless, because I really thought, and there was reason to think, that when Macron was elected, there would be significant initiatives to try to deal with the situation of Muslims in France. But Macron has faced huge pressure from the right. And so he has not been willing to take any significant initiatives that might help out Le Pen and the Rassemblement National. And in fact, some of his ministers have made comments that, as I say, dominant, Le Pen isn't anti-Islamic enough, and other kinds of comments that certainly don't indicate that he's going to do anything. For example, the same Minister of the Interior pointed out how shocked he was going into a supermarket at how many shelves there were of kosher and halal food. Just think of that. Would that bother you if you go into a supermarket and found that there was kosher and halal food and, other kinds of ethnic stuff? No, because it's the point that, there's a kind of conformism in France, that everybody should really be the same. That part of being French is eating the same kind of food and so on, which, look, I like French food, but the fact that you might not be interested in having pork doesn't make you a bad Frenchman. But there's a lot of people who think, well, that's the case. School lunches, one thing, you can do that would really help a lot is make sure that every school in France, there is substitute meals, for example, vegetarian, which anybody can eat. But there's a huge resistance. Majority of the French don't think that should be the case. There shouldn't be special meals for other people. The level of conformism is pretty strong. And the government is not going to deal with it. One of the things that you really would need in France is you need an organization of Muslims that can effectively represent them and speak to the government, and to which the government can speak. And the thing is that this exists for, Protestants and Jews. Napoleon set up a consistory, which is an organization that brings together the religious leadership. He set up for his own reasons. And if the government needs to talk to Jews, it can talk to the consistory, to talk to religious Jews. And then there's an organization called the CRIF, which represents Jewish organizations, not necessarily religious. And they always have plenty to say to the government, and the government can talk to them. But what about Muslims? Well, Muslims didn't exist in the Napoleonic period. Otherwise, Napoleon would have said, I'm going to structure the Muslim community the way I did everybody else. In fact, if that had happened, things would have taken a completely different course, in my opinion. So it's only very late that France can have that kind of organization. But the government couldn't couldn't officially put it together because the government is supposed to be non-denominational, and laïcité means it doesn't interfere with religion. So they've had a lot of difficulty in putting together an organization representing Muslims, and Muslims are profoundly divided. Like each nationality group, Algerian, Moroccan, Turk, has its own kinds of identity. And then there are these international Muslim organizations. So when you try to set up an organization representing Muslims, they really don't agree, they fight, and they don't represent ordinary. You can't say to Muslims, okay, you vote, because Muslims don't exist officially, because France doesn't identify its citizens on the basis of religion. So it becomes very difficult to do it. They try to put together something called the CFCM. They finally failed, and now Macron is trying to find some other organization. So it's hard to speak to Muslims, and hard to Muslims as a group to speak to the government. So there's not that kind of necessary dialogue. And the Muslim community is very divided. But I think an organization representing Muslims would be a really good thing. It would help them speak truth to power, but it's not likely to happen. I think the most important things you can do for Muslims, as you have a community that's bifurcated, you have a highly educated group at the top, highly educated. You take a look at the book reviews in France, a lot of the most important books being written by people with Muslim names. You look at people in government staffs, Macron had all kinds of people with Muslim names, Algerian, Moroccan names, who are advisors. So there's a huge, a really great group of people on the top. The problem is that the bottom, it's many fewer people who have, high school or college degrees. There's a very large group of very poor people, not well educated, and they, at a time of high employment, are always at the bottom. And if you have these communities that are isolated, segregated, so I think the government would need to do something like affirmative action, but they won't do it, and they can't do it, and they want to give the National Front ammunition, and they don't believe in that kind of thing because it goes against the French idea of equality. So it's very hard for this to happen. Getting people out of those huge cités, well, it's important, but what are you going to knock them all down? I mean, it's a huge building. If you get a chance to see the movie Les Miserables, not the Victor Hugo novel, but a very recent film from a few years ago, it takes place in one of those cités. It gives you a sense of what they look like and what they feel like. It's unbelievable. It has nothing to do with France, the kind of France that most people see when they go to Paris. That has to be changed. And I think there's another dimension which is really complicated, and that is there's a kind of anti-religious feeling in France. It goes back to the revolution. The concept of laïcité, the government should be neutral about religion, is a great idea, but it's not like the separation of church and state in this country. There's an animus in it that was against the Catholic Church. For obvious reasons, the Catholic Church was on the side of the kings and the nobility, and when you had a republic in 1875, Catholicism was the enemy. As Gambetta said, le clericalisme voilà l'ennemi. Clericalism said, well, the point is that any organization that's sort of visible, manifest, seems like a threat to the French state. Well, that's one thing that the Muslims are. They're very manifest in their dress, in some cases, in religious ceremonies in the street. And that really upsets the French. Sense that women are badly treated means that a lot of feminists and people on the left don't like Islam. So I think the recognition that you're living in an age where religion is not disappearing, where it's there, and that you simply have to accept religious diversity would be a really great thing for France. But it's hard to happen.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one final question, but while I do, my note to everybody in the room is, your time is coming, okay? So I want you to pull up your questions and have them in your mind. For those of you who are participating online, I'm going to give you once again the address where you can send your questions. It's G as in global, E as in Europe, and P as in program, GEP, at wilsoncenter.org. So my final question,
Is this going to be a
again,
hard question?
it is going to be hard. Okay. You mean the others have been too easy? Oh, I'm
No,
sorry.
they've been all hard, but this.
Yeah, okay. The last one is, a process of writing a book like this. What was it in that process that surprised you? Was there something that you learned or that you pulled out of that was surprising to you?
So that is a good question.
I'm glad.
So let's say I don't think there's anything in this that surprised me in the sense this is something I was not aware of. But there was something, when you study France, most people who study France have a kind of Francophile attitude. It's a country we like. I mean, Benjamin Franklin once said, every man has two countries, his own and France. Think about that. Benjamin Franklin said that, around the time of the American Revolution. That's during the French monarchy. And clearly, Benjamin Franklin was smart enough to know that most people in France had a pretty lousy life and were pretty oppressed. But he saw all the great part, because he hobnobbed with all the great thinkers and, Voltaire and so on. And he thought, and it was the most sophisticated society in Europe. So I think that it's very easy to not want to see the negative sides of French life. And look, there's nothing there I didn't know. I knew about Vichy, about all that, and what happened to the Jews, obviously. But, you make an effort sort of not to dwell on it necessarily, talk about other things. So I think when writing this book, in terms of seeing the levels of anti-Semitism and the French role in the Holocaust and the brutality of French colonialism in North Africa, you see a really harsh side of French life. And there's a great statement in a novel by, that talks about Tunisia during colonialism and during the war. And the 1943, the Germans actually invade Tunisia. And the French authorities simply make no effort to protect the Jewish population. We're now working for the Germans, they say in this novel. And the comment made by a character in the novel, which surely represents the author, is, my whole vision of France collapsed. But I realized that the French gendarmes were just as French as Racine and Descartes. France was like all those things. It was the nation of enlightenment and culture. It was a nation of brutes who put themselves in the service of the Germans and collaborated. And that's the kind of thing that's kind of in your face when you study this kind of subject.
Okay, thank you. All right, excellent. I have at least one question. So remember, turn on your microphone, and then when you finish, turn it off. Do please identify yourself. I know Stephen knows you, but not everybody else does.
Well, I wanted to get my question in before Professor Lamprakos got hers in. Any rate, my name is George Topic. I work at National Defense University, and Stephen and I have been friends for a long time. And one of the discussion questions that we've had based on the last chapter of the book is, what should we be taking away from this book and from your work about the assimilation of minorities into society in a broader context in terms of what governments might do, even our own government here, But, what comments do you have on that, Stephen?
Well, I'm not going to talk about our own government because this is a publicly funded institution and I should mind my own business.
We're nonpartisan.
No, I think that it shows how incredibly difficult it is. So we're talking about, in this research, a period that's over 200 years in terms of French Jews, and 1830, 190 years. Is it possible? 190 years in terms of the French and Muslims. I think that one thing it proves is that you have to address historical memory and historical experience. Almost like a Freudian point of view, that the root of many of our problems go back far into the past, and even you have to address the unconscious element of it. I think that applies very much to these great social problems, especially dealing with minorities. You have to put a lot of this on the surface and actually talk about it, and then try to come to terms with it. And I think that's true, in every country, because almost every country has some kind of problem like this. You can't resolve it by denying the past. But you also have to try to bring it up in a way that's not just, making hits against the other group. Remember what you did in this time at that time. You have to bring it all to the surface, but also try to discuss it in a calm kind of way. Like in South Africa, Truth and Reconciliation was a really great idea. I don't know if that's solved everything, but you need that in a very broad way. Some societies, have the capacity to do that because there are certain beliefs that societies have that make it possible to justify that. In the United States, we certainly have a notion of pluralism that we can use to help address issues. In the case of France, you also have that kind of thing. And Renan, in his great speech, What is a Nation?" pointed out that nations are not based on, at least not France, on a common, ethnic, genetic pool. They're based not on even the same language. They're based on the voluntary adherence of population to ideals. The plebiscite of every day. That's a wonderful term. I think France and the United States are both like that, which means we can work out things. We have the potential to work out things if we're willing to do it. That has to be done in a calm and deliberate way and not finger-pointing. That's my answer.
So, as predicted, we have a question from Dr. Lambrakos.
She can't do that. That's not fair.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm going to read it. In Algeria, the French colonial government used Islam and even encouraged an official Islam to define North Africans and deny them civil rights. Yet within France, religion is not recognized or permitted in the public realm according to the doctrine of laïcité. Can you say a few words about this other double standard?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a, thank you very much, Dr. Lamprakos. Glad to have a chance to, get your question. So it's when I talked about how the civilizing mission was an unbelievable fraud. I mean, honest to God, total fraud. Notwithstanding, there may have been some people who really believed in it, but it was never existed. The way in which the French used religion in Algeria was really something else. So, when France finally proclaimed the separation of church and state in 1905, government was not going to become involved. Before that, the church and state were not separated. But the French had set up in Algeria an official Islam. The French funded, their brand of Islam, which, surprisingly enough, were telling the Algerian population why they should obey the colonial authorities and all that kind of thing. When they ended that, and laïcité, separation of church-state, you hear that all the time. It's a big foundation in modern France. What did they do in Nigeria? Oh, maybe not, because that official Islam was so indispensable to maintain social order, so they continued to fund it. And in addition, in Nigeria, people who were Algerians, who weren't French citizens or Jews, were defined as Muslims. That was their official definition. They were Muslims. I mean, you have a case that went to a high court in France of a guy who converted to Catholicism, and he was still defined on his passport as Muslim. I mean, so there's the paradox. The French are telling these people they're Muslim. Much later, people from Algeria come to France, and the French tell them, separation of church and state, no such thing as, we can't do anything in terms of religion. It's completely private, and don't be too blatant in the way you manifest it. So yes, Algerians who were told that they were Muslim now are being told in France, you're not supposed to think of yourself as Muslim. You're supposed to think of yourself as individual French citizen, and the state can't do anything special for you because that's no longer our business. The level of hypocrisy is really extraordinary. There were actually elements in Algeria, if you want, hypocrisy goes both ways, who demanded the end of the separation of church and state so they could use religion for their own purposes, the ulema movement. Anyway, that's another story. So yes, I think that was an excellent question. I commend you for that question, Dr. Lamprakos.
Okay. Anybody else? We have a couple of minutes left. Anyone else in the room with a question?
Does it work? Yes. Hi, I'm Masha Twirk, hopefully joining the Global Europe program soon.
Oh.
I have a question. So you talked a lot about the secular state and how the government works in France based on this principle, and that this also causes significant issues in them successfully dealing with the French Muslim community. And I was just thinking if you maybe have an insight also in how the French government then deals with the Jewish community as well, and if that maybe then plays, if there are any differences, and if that plays then into the perceived animosities then between the Muslim and the Jewish community in France.
Well, look, the Jewish community has, I think, never gotten over the historical memory of what happened during the war in France, but also in North Africa, where Jews lost their citizenship as well in North Africa and were treated in a horrible way. And I think that the confidence that existed and the love for France, it was so strong on the part of French Jews, was shaken, really shaken. And it doesn't take much to revive that. Everybody in the Jewish community remembers the line of Prime Minister Raymond Barre under Giscard sentence when he said that during an attack by Muslim extremists, Jews against the synagogue, in Jews he talked about innocent Frenchmen, who were wounded. Innocent Frenchmen meaning the non-Jews. No one's going to forget that. No one's going to forget. So no one is going to forget the fact that at various points, French government sort of didn't take a strong position on attacks on Jews by Muslims, because that's a real problem. It's a genuine problem. There are large numbers of attacks against Jews, and many, many Jews, a large part of the Jewish population, has suffered insults or physical attacks. The statistics are right there that I used in the book. there's this sense that the French government is not doing enough. There's sort of a lack of trust. And, I think that a lot of the time that's not fair, and some of the times it is. But the sense that you can't count on France, that's one of the results of the experience of the war. And the abandonment that Algerian Jews felt, like all Algerian settlers, the abandonment in 1962. From our point of view, which is usually anti-colonial, we see what the French had done in that colony, but from the point of view of North African Jews, there was a sense that they were abandoned, and they had no place in North Africa. And so I think that's a factor. Look at this, what happened in Tunisia a few days ago when there was a pilgrimage to a famous synagogue in Jerba, and one of the security guards grabbed a gun from his colleague and killed a bunch of people. The sense of never being certain, I think that this is felt very much by French Jews who are very different from American Jews, and whose politics are very different, and who have moved successfully to the right, unlike most American Jews. So you have to understand that kind of thing. Traumatized by Vichy, the war, Algeria. Yeah.
So with that, I think that has to be our last question. So I thank all of you for coming. For those of you who have joined online, I thank you too, and thank you for your questions. And I know that you will enjoy reading this book. I'm going to add one thing to your policy recommendations, and that is for anyone surprised by what is on grocery store shelves. It just shows that ministers of government perhaps need to do some of their own grocery shopping now and again. And with that, I am going to close this up. Thank you all for your attention. I appreciate you. Hope we see you again next time.